actually. Some of the students from the fall said, "Hey, that was so cool that you brought that up. I've been using it all the time in my church." So here you go. You've got those difficult texts and passages, and here we're having a conversation about the Nephilim. And here's what I say. As an honest Hebrew scholar, I recognize that in all of Bible, in all of God's Word, there's issues that we come across from the text, rightly understood, and we're all part of this what would be called the hermeneutical spiral. So we're in community, which is where we need to be. We're reading God's Word, but we need to be willing to say, I might be wrong. I might need to be corrected, or I have a position, but it could change. You'll hear me say, "This isn't wet concrete." It's not. So here we have the three buckets, and got to remember what they were. So we have, let's see, what's the first bucket? I'm having another senior moment. Boy, this has been a brutal morning for me. So you have your opinions right here. This is a bucket full of a lot of opinions. They come from reading the Word, and you've got certain ideas about things, but anything in your opinions bucket is not something that you'd break fellowship over, or you'd leave a church over, or tell somebody that you don't like them, or something like that. In the middle bucket, you have something that might be a little more weighty. You have your persuasions. I spell that right? Persuasions bucket. Now you feel a little more strongly and a little more strongly attached to your persuasions. So those might come out of a close reading of the text and a real heavy study of something. Maybe you've read a book on something. You've formed some pretty strong persuasions, enough that you might want to have coffee with a friend and say, I think I might be right here, and here are my reasons why. But you wouldn't break a church up over a persuasion either. And lastly, we have the final bucket, which is called the convictions bucket. And this bucket is something that you put things in there when you're absolutely convinced. These are the non-negotiables, right? You know what they are. Those things that you would be even willing to die for, those convictions. Absolute truths, unmistakably from the text. These are the things that we would break fellowship up over if we're part of a believing community. Here's what I find. I think sometimes we meet up with people who put way too many things in the convictions bucket. And it's almost as if every single thing that they have has to be in the convictions bucket, and they're ready to put on their boxing gloves with you whenever you come and knock on their door. But I think that, this doesn't make you liberal. We're not talking about that. We're talking about certain things that, no, I have an opinion about this, but, I'm still a work in progress. You can use this as a way of defusing the people who come to you in ministry who have one of these and is absolutely convinced, and you're wrong and they're right, but you can challenge them with this as well. Let's back up a little bit here. So that's just something that might be a helpful tool for you in ministry as you personally think through things. If you're in a position to present or teach or preach, right, on one of these, I call them sticky wickets, difficult texts. You can represent yourself this way in front of a congregation, I think, or a youth group or a Sunday school class, and I think handle and navigate through something, and also model for your folks. Oh, I can breathe a little bit now. You help them defuse a bit sometimes, I think, when you talk about it in these terms. So hopefully that'll be a little bit helpful for you. You can apply that and use it if it's helpful. But the Nephilim and the discussion of the Nephilim would be one of those things I'd probably put maybe in that first bucket, maybe a little bit into the second bucket, but I would never break a church up over that. Or although sometimes I run into people who have that in their convictions bucket. This is who the Nephilim are. Anyway. All right. Enough said on that. We're on and everything's good? You're recording? Okay, good. Well, here's my big nib marker. It's double thick, so hopefully y'all got to see that on the whiteboard at home. All right, let's keep going here. Deuteronomy. 1 Samuel chapter 18. We're going to see David having some early successes. He's going to become best friends with Saul's son, Jonathan. And let's have some people read here. And let's go over here to see Ryan Keiser. No. Have I already been on this? Kate, why don't you read for us? Chapter 18, verses 1 through 4.
Now it came about when he had finished speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. Okay, one thing I do want to point out here in terms of this passage, the unique relationship that Jonathan and David shared. You see the word covenant and you see the word love in the same context. I just want to remind everybody that the idea of love, if you have love being expressed, for example, and we see this in the texts that come from the ancient Near East that have correspondence between kings. I know I shared this last semester, but it's good to remind ourselves. Love means loyalty. Love is a term in the ancient world that you have kings writing to each other, "I love you, king," or I am your father and you are my son. There's this familial language that's used when a covenant is being discussed in correspondence between kings. So we have here friends, but this loyalty idea comes through in the language of love. Love means loyalty. In verse 5, David's going to find success. And you see the emphasis, David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered, or the idea is acted wisely. Saul sent him over the men of war, set him over the men of war. So here's David's victory over the Philistine giant is going to allow him opportunities, kind of like if we remember all the way back to maybe Joseph, rising up in the court of Pharaoh. The Lord is with him. The Lord is opening up doors and causing his way or his path to prosper. So, and it was pleasing in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And then it continues in verse, we see a kind of a short, condensed, David's immediate success little chapter right here. He's going to gain more popularity amongst the people. Let's see, could I have Mark Lindgren? Yeah, could you read verses 6 through 9?
As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000. And Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him. He said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom?" And Saul eyed David from that day on. Okay. So you see the beginning, and that picture that I showed you there, Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. And this is Saul's first attempt against David is right here. I didn't have it in my notes, but then it came about on the next day. An evil spirit from God, again, was allowed to come upon Saul. He raved in the midst of his house while David was playing his harp. Right in the midst of the music therapy session, a spear was in Saul's hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, "I'll pin David to the wall," but David escaped from his presence twice. And it's interesting that from chapters 20 through 27, there's detailed, we have the adventures, really from this point on, of David fleeing Saul. And it's significant. We won't look at the details, but a couple of different times during this kind of episode, David had a chance to return the favor to Saul and kill Saul, but David ends up demonstrating here, you might say, his loyalty or his love for Saul. because Saul is the king. And David's going to act in consistency with his upbringing from that little country church town, Bethlehem. David even resorts to living with the Philistines as an attempt to fleeing from Saul. David, and by this time he has loyal men, the mighty men, who are a traveling group of loyal soldiers. They earn the trust of the Philistines at this time. And we have this Philistine king, Achish, who's the son of the king of Gath. Achish is going to give David and these men their own Philistine town to live in. So let's flash forward just a little bit in chapter 27. Let's turn there. David's fleeing to the Philistines. And see, Mark, keep reading there for us in verses 5 through 7 in chapter 27.
And then David said to Achish, I have found favor in your eyes. Let a place be given me in one of the country towns, that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you? That day Achish gave him Ziklag. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. And the number of the days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months.
So it's a significant time. David is now literally in enemy lines, but even David, because he's loyal and seems to know how to demonstrate loyalty, can earn the favor and trust of a Philistine king. Now, if we fast forward a little bit, we're going to see that this particular, we're going to see the aspect of King David showing through even again. In chapter 30, we see a reversal take place. And after an Amalekite, remember the Amalekites, they raid this town of Ziklag, and this is the town where David and his men were allowed to reside in the Philistia. The Amalekite raiders kidnap all of the women and children and the young boys left behind while David and his loyal men are out doing their thing. And at a pivotal moment, we see the anointed king of Israel at risk of losing everything in chapter 30. I mean, this gets to a boiling point. This is a crisis moment for King David. If you've ever looked at this text in any detail, in chapter 30, let's pick it up in verse 3. When David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. Some of the more dramatic moments in movies I've seen are when a group of burly, hairy, muscular, muscle-bound soldiers start to weep and grieve over a scene very much like this. Now David's 2 wives had been taken captive, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. Moreover, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him. For all the people who were very much embittered, each one because of his sons and his daughters. But this is what a wholehearted king does, right? In crisis moments, and again, it's one of those big buts of the Bible. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And then he takes over the situation. He pauses for a moment, gets his wits about him, and prays and turns this thing over to the Lord. And what we see is a reversal. David's able to rally his own men and rout the Amalekites and restore the families to each of his men. And this is what happens eventually, as we see as a result. So in the meantime, we see Saul's inattention to the voice of the Lord. Saul's continuing to not directly listen to the Lord. In this case, he's going to consult a witch as a battle with the Philistines is rapidly approaching. And let's turn to chapter 28. We go back to 28, backtrack just a little bit. In chapter 28, let's read beginning in verse 5 and get our heads around this account here. Let's see, I have Amy. Why don't you read for us, if you're ready, chapter 28, beginning of verse 5, down through verse 14.
When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams, or by Urim, or by prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, "Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her." And his servant said to him, "Behold, there is a medium at Endor." So Saul disguised himself and put on other garments and went, he and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night. And he said, "Divine for me by a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you." And the woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death?" But Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing." Then the woman said, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" He said, "Bring up Samuel for me." And the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You were Saul." And the king said to her, "Do not be afraid. What do you see?" And the woman said to Saul, "I see a god coming up out of the earth." He said to her, What is his appearance?" And she said, "An old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe." And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage.
Okay. Well, speaking of opinions, persuasions, and convictions, this is another one of those difficult passages to interpret. One of the things that we learn in our hermeneutics class, if you haven't had it yet, is we try to weigh texts like this and contexts like this and evaluate texts like this and try to understand, with allowing what's the term, the idea of letting Scripture, right, interpret Scripture. And one of the things that struck me as I was thinking through this passage again is, in evaluating Saul, what kind of king should he have been in terms of trying to hear and listen from the Lord? What was supposed to be his proper activity? Instead of, you see that the Lord has turned off the conduit of information in verse 6 by dreams or the Urim or the or the prophets, or if Saul was on track, what would this picture look like? I guess that's my question. And let's remind ourselves one more time, and I did, we turn back to Deuteronomy 17. Deuteronomy 17. And we always come back to this. This is one of the foundational criteria for the kind of king that should be active in Israel. The one that's chosen by God. In verses 14 down, let's move down to verse 18, chapter 17. "Now it shall come about when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of the Torah on a scroll in the presence of the priests. It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by carefully observing all the words of this Torah and these statutes, that his heart may be lifted up, not be lifted up above his countrymen, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, in order that he and his sons may continue long in his kingdom in the midst of Israel." So this idea of being closely connected to the Word of God, in this case the Torah, but as God's Word continues to kind of roll along, the Bible of the day, what should the king be doing? He should be involved in writing it, reading it, and living it, and that way the king is always in the best position to literally hear from the Lord, and we don't have the need now to think about doing any of this kind of thing with regards to why would it be necessary to consult, what was your translation, necromancer in this case, or this witch, right? This witch at Endor, this medium, this woman who's serving to conjure up the dead, as if that's the divine means by which the Lord communicates, especially to kings. So you see what's wrong with this picture, even from the beginning. And what's a little bit tricky, I'll have to admit, is understanding the ins and outs of, is this really Samuel? I mean, what's going on here? Is he coming back from the dead? Where is Samuel at the moment of him speaking here, and all of that? It's somewhat of a little bit tricky, but it's not like the Lord not being able to speak through a donkey. We've got Balaam and the donkey, and communicating at that time some pretty significant words of truth. So the ironic twist is that Saul finally hears from Samuel, and maybe for the first time in his life, Saul listens to Samuel, which is kind of the irony of the whole thing, even from this pagan witch. So the other irony that we see here is how Saul responds to the message of Samuel. Let's look at verses 15 through 20. Did we read that? Yeah, let's read that one, Amy. Keep reading there.
You said 15 through 20?
Yes, in chapter 28.
Then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me, bringing me up?" And Saul answered, "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me what I shall do." And Samuel said, "Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned away from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord, and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines."
And one more verse.
Then Saul fell at once full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel, and there was no strength in him, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night.
Okay, so interesting response that Saul demonstrates in response to this message from Samuel. In verse 20, he fell, literally the Hebrew says, in the fullness of his height, he fell. Which is quite a fall. You fall from the heights. In this case, Saul must have had a lot of height from which to fall. Not just his physical height, but I might drag it a little further to suggest that Saul's been consistent in his series of making wrong decisions and rebellious decisions. So he's falling into a pretty high hole that he's dug for himself. Maybe that way. Might preach a little bit there. But he's also going to, the next day in battle, Saul is going to fall from the mountain of height. That's interesting. Let's look at that. Let's flash forward a little bit in chapter 31. And this is the tragedy. This is how 1 Samuel ends, in the tragic end that we read about in 1 Samuel 31. The battle is going on. I'll pick it up in verse... Saul says in verse 4, he says to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and pierce me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and pierce me through and make sport of me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. So Saul took his sword and fell on it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. And Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all of his men on that day together. And this is all taking place on the mountain of height the next day in battle. So verse 8, "And it came about on the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa," which is kind of a wordplay on Givah, the word that means to be tall or high. So that's what's going on there. At this moment, we hear the echo of Hannah's prayer and the lament that we have from King David. And And we jump over to 2 Samuel chapter 1. And immediately, again, we have the wholehearted King David. Even in the death of Saul, after all of the, you might say, that being chased around the whole world, literally, what's David do? How does he respond to Saul? Let's take a look at chapter 2, chapter 1, and picking up in verse 19. He's writing a song, King David, the musician, as a dirge or a lament for the death of Saul and his best friend Jonathan. Let's see. Could we have John up here? Could you read for us beginning in verse 17 in 2 Samuel chapter 1?
David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan, and he ordered that the people of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. It is written in the book of Jasher. A gazelle lies slain on your heights, Israel, how the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it on the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. Mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain, may no showers fall on your cherished fields, for there the shield of the mighty was despised, the shield of Saul no longer rubbed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. Saul and Jonathan in life, they were loved and admired. In death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen, the weapons of war have perished.
Oh, you just got to the end. I was looking at line 25. Okay, good. You see the emphasis, how the mighty have fallen, how the mighty have fallen. It's an emphasis of being tall, and the tall, the mighty have fallen. So this, the break between 1 and 2 Samuel, we just kind of like read right through. It's really all one continuous narrative in the original. Just know that. Probably broken up in time because of the size of the scrolls, the technology of the day in terms of the scroll, the 1 Samuel scroll, the 2 Samuel scroll, broken up by basically by size is probably what's going on. So we get to the end of 1 Samuel, and then we begin 2 Samuel, and here we have another picture, of course 2 Samuel, right? And we continue to have the ongoing success of King David. Now things will escalate now that Saul is dead. Things will now escalate for King David, and we're going to pick up with chapter 2 and look at verse 1. Now let's just look at this, and then I'm going to have to transfer to the next slide set. So I just noticed that. I may have everybody take a quick stand-up break or go introduce yourself to somebody in the class. But let's take a look at chapter 1 very first here. And so after the Song of Lament, David is going to, we see the beginnings in chapter 2, verse 1, to be made king over Israel. And he's going to be anointed. Verses 1 through 7. It came about afterwards that David inquired of the Lord, saying, Shall I go up to one of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said to him, Go up. And David said, Where shall I go? And he said, To Hebron. David went there, and his 2 wives went with him. And David brought up his men who were there with him in the household, and they lived in the city of Hebron. Then the men of Judah came, and there anointed David king over all of the house of Judah. And they said, or told David, saying, It was the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul. Is anything wrong with that picture? Verse 4. Yeah? Were all of the tribes there and represented? Doesn't seem to be, right? No, they're not. And so this is going to be kind of we ask ourselves the question, where are the rest of the tribes And so let's do this. I'm just going to change my PowerPoint slide and get the next one going here. I do want y'all to find somebody that you don't know, walk over to that person, introduce yourself, and share something significant about yourself or your family or any kind of ministry that you might currently be involved in. All right, let's do that. Break. Everybody move. Oh, shoot. Okay. That. Are we good? Is it good? Yeah? Okay. Well, we're going to this one. Yeah. Did they change? Yep. I'd have to think about that one. Oh, I see. Yeah, you can go and come back really quick. Okay, let's come back together, everybody. We're in the home stretch. All right. All right, but so we read in the text in chapter 2. Up until this time, the only tribe that's recognized King David as king is the tribe of Judah and the house of Judah so far. But we look down to verse 8, and we see in verse 8 through 11, let's see, Gabriel, where are you? There, in the back. Let's have you read again in chapter 2, verses 8 down through 11.
8 through 11.
Yes.
But Abner, the son of Ner, captain of Saul's host, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim.
Mahanaim.
Mahanaim? Mahanaim. And made him king over Gilead, and over the Asherites, and over Jezreel, and over Ephraim, and over Benjamin, and over all
Israel.
Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 14 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and reigned 2 years. But the house of Judah followed David.
So, crisis moment number what? We've had a lot for King David. This is going to be what's akin to a civil war, with regards to the history of our own country. It's north versus south. And this is what breaks out. We've got Israel acting against the house of Judah, and we're going to get our own king, and that's what they do. Ishbosheth, whose name means man of shame. It's interesting name to name your child. This is kind of a fracture moment, and while King David is able to, as we'll see, politically restore sanity for a time, but you might think of this as like the beginning of the fracture that will eventually lead to the divided kingdom. And especially when we get to Solomon, David's son, who will take the baton. And we think of Solomon's heart as that half heart. We'll get to Solomon and try to figure him out a little bit, and we see elements of both showing up, surprisingly. According to the author, I call him the half-hearted king, in contrast to Saul and in contrast to David. But the divided heart for Solomon, I think, will seal the deal with regards to this growing fracture, and will lead to the divided kingdom. And that's eventually what we'll see at the end of Solomon's reign. Yeah?
What was the problem with Israel, with the northern tribes taking leadership from Judah? Was the attitude that these people are, shepherds and country folk, or what was their problem with not having a kingdom off the bat?
That's a huge question. In this immediate context, we see the alliance still with Saul, and the alliance of wanting to be loyal to Saul and one of his sons. So there's still the focus here of the what's the word? The continuity, not continuity, but the carry on with Saul. Saul's dead, but we want one of his sons to take over, not David. So that's what's behind this immediate threat. The civil war we have described here, and we see it in verses 12 all the way down through verse 32. We're going to have the battle, chapter 3, we see verse 1. There was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. So you see there's the division. So you think of the household of Saul, and any son underneath him is the legitimate king. David grew steadily stronger, but the house of Saul grew continually weaker. And we see that really we've got these two military commanders. Abner is the military commander for the house of Saul, and Joab for the house of David. There in chapter 2, verse 12, beginning of verse 12. So there's Abner, the son of Ner, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon with the servants of Ishbosheth, the sons of Saul, and Joab, the son of Zeruiah, the servants of David, went out and met them by the pool of Gibeon, and they sat down one on the one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. So there's the opposition, the military commanders, and this is the civil war that takes place. After a series of events, both Abner and Ishbosheth are assassinated. And we move to chapter 5. We see the assassination and the murder of Ishbosheth in chapter 4. And then finally in chapter 5, we have kind of a reversal take place. Then all the tribes in verse 1. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and your flesh." There's a line in my play that I say, when Adam's flesh and Adam's bone sits at Cair Paravel enthroned, the time of evil will be over and done. You know this line. How do you know it?
I've read the Chronicles over.
Okay, I'm glad I got it right. Okay. Yes.
Question.
Sure.
How public was Samuel's anointing of David? Do people know about it? Was that like only David and some close friends of David know about Samuel's birth?
Yeah, it seemed like more of a localized, spiritual.
When did that become public knowledge to Israel?
It seems like it's kind of got jump-started again, and finally in chapter 5 we finally have everybody together, all of Israel. Not until then, though.
Okay.
So it starts with we saw that the Lord's anointing Samuel and just the immediate household, the house, David's, with the presence of his father and the whole household. That was the immediate anointing that authenticated him as the true spiritual king. But then making it political, all the while we see that Saul's in the way. And until Saul runs his course, do we see David moving in and becoming the authentic political king.
So for the most part, the public wasn't aware of the two-king kind of friction that was occurring,
Yeah, I don't think I don't know if we have a lot to go on there, but it would make sense that Saul, obviously, when Saul's killed, the recognition of David takes a little time to kick in here. So that was the public responding, and finally, they have to fight a battle over a war, north versus south, before David's recognized by all Israel. Let's take a look at that in chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. All the tribes of Israel, so that's the key, came to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and your flesh. Previously, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and in. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will be a ruler over Israel." So there's the spiritual acknowledgement. Maybe that took a while to get out. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them before the Lord at Hebron, and they anointed David king over Israel. So David began at this time, finally as a 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And finally, we'll see David's able to establish the headquarters in Jerusalem to finish out his reign for the final 33 years over all Israel and all Judah. All right, so that's what we have. Now, what happens next? David, like any king that we've seen before, is going to get to work. And the first task at hand is to capture Jerusalem. This stage in history, it's being occupied by a people group, the Jebusites. And so Jerusalem will be captured by David and strengthened as the capital city of Israel. Let's take a look at that in 2 Samuel chapter 2. Is that right? 2? No. I want to look at chapter 5, 2 through... okay. If we go back to chapter 2, verses 7 through 11. No. I've messed myself up. I'm sorry. Chapter 5, verses... Okay. I think it's... I want to start at chapter 5, verses 6. So let's have... Kelsey, could you read for us beginning in verse 6? And I'll tell you when to stop. Down through verse 11, I think. Is Kelsey here? Oh, sorry. How about Calvin left? How about Michael Sanders? Could you read for us? Yeah, thanks.
Chapter 5?
Yes.
6?
Beginning of verse 6.
And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, "You will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off," thinking, "David cannot come in here." Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David. And David said on that day, Whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul. Therefore, it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David.
Okay. Okay. I called it the city of David, and David built it all around. Yeah, okay. So verse 13 is interesting, as he's got this, he's got his stronghold. He's established himself in Jerusalem. But look at verse 13 in chapter 5. This is interesting. You start to see right away, oh no, here we go. It's some kind of, I wouldn't say it a political fracture, but do we have some kind of spiritual fracture in verse 13? Meanwhile, David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he came from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to him. So then we have a little bit of a genealogy. So this is a problem. We'll see if it's a problem. David's going to gain victory over the Philistines in chapter 5. Look over at verse 23 and 20 through 25. When David inquired of the Lord, he said, "You shall not go directly up. Circle around behind them and come at them in the front of the balsam trees. And it shall be, when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then you shall act promptly. For the Lord will have gone out before you to strike the army of the Philistines." And you see the contrast here between David and Saul. David's continuing to act consistently with how he knows the battles should be fought in Israel. It's the Lord who gives the military victory. David did so in verse 25, just as the Lord had commanded him, and struck down the Philistines from Giv'ah as far as Gezer. All right. Then we move into another interesting passage here in terms of the ark. And unlike Saul, David's going to show concern for the Ark of the Covenant. So he authorizes it to be returned now to the freshly captured and conquered capital city, Jerusalem. And interestingly, the first attempt is met with a little bit of surprise and shock. We see that Uzzah is reaching out to support the Ark of the Covenant just as it was about to fall off the cart. 2 Samuel, let's look at chapter 6, verses 5 through 7. And let's have, let's see. Could I have Lauren? Could I have you read, please? Chapter 6, verses 5 through 7.
David and the whole house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with all kinds of fir-wood instruments, lyres, harps, tambourines, sistrums, and cymbals. When they came to make consecration for it, Uzzah reached out to the ark of God and took hold of it because the oxen had stumbled. Then the Lord's anger burned against Uzzah, and God struck him dead on the spot for his irreverence, and he died there next to the ark of God.
That's kind of that'll end a party really quick, right? You've got this huge celebration led by the song-leading king with now more instruments that he's involved. The corporation, he's got his own little praise band set up now. But this tragedy happens. What's interesting, if we want to look at the context for this, it kind of leaps out at us. Oh my, look at what just happened. One of the things that we know, if we turn back to Numbers chapter 4, we want to turn back to Numbers chapter 4 and verse 15. We have some prescriptions or some instructions or some teaching that was given to us by Moses about the ark. Chapter 4, verse 15. "And when Aaron and his sons have finished covering the holy objects and all their furnishings of the sanctuary, when the camp is to set out, after that the sons of Kohath shall come to carry them, so that they may not touch the holy objects and die. These are the things in the tent of meeting which the sons of Kohath are to carry." And there was some severity in how these holy objects were to be carried and transported. The ark should have been carried by hand, but on long poles, or what we would call staves, those long poles, and you've seen them pictured. And it appears that Uzzah, and the king that should have known better, I hate to be critical, but you wonder if King David should have known better about, look, you guys over there, handle this thing with care. And here's the proper, Mosaic teaching to instruct us in how to carry this ark. So it appears that as it gets caught in the crossfire, you might say, of David's irresponsibility. And this also amplifies the fact that there's some severity with regards to the preservation and the recognition of these objects of holiness, which a good king in Israel should be on the forefront of his thinking at this kind of situation. In this kind of situation, David should have been very much overseeing and reminding the people and directing the situation maybe a little more closely, I'd say. The other thing that we can look at here is David needed to be reminded that Jerusalem also maybe cannot be religiously stamped. So, in other words, we cannot just bring the ark into Jerusalem and hope that, that's going to be we've got the upper hand now on God kind of thing. Like the ark is a rabbit's foot. And David can't think that he can now have an approved capital city, a spiritually approved capital city now, just because the ark is in the midst of it. The Lord's presence follows the faithfulness and fidelity of his people. And David needs to be reminded that the Lord he cares about the details. David needs to be reminding himself by reading the Torah, Deuteronomy 17:14-20, and all of these things. So, and David will learn some lessons along the way. He's presented warts and all by the author as we progress ahead. So let's pick up with this next week. And finish out King David and King Solomon and move into the time period of the divided monarchy.